Amanda. As you and everyone else who's been on the internet in the past 4 days knows, the American Supreme Court has deemed same-sex marriage as upheld by the Constitution. While it certainly is a huge success, there are many issues that still plague the gender, sexual, and romantic minorities in America. So I thought I would take some time to talk about at least a few of these issues. One big issue that I know a few people have been talking about is job discrimination in the U.S. Only 22 states provide protection against job discrimination based on sexuality, and only 19 of those protect against gender identity as well. Which means that in over half the country you can be fired for your sexual orientation and you can be fired for being trans. And you can actually see the damage that this does through looking at the unemployment rates, especially among trans individuals and especially among individuals who are also a racial minority as well as a gender, sexual, or romantic minority. Homelessness is an issue in the LGBT community, especially for LGBT teens. 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. There aren't very clear statistics for adult homeless people, but however, the places that I have looked at that have taken note of gender identity and sexual orientation did see a disproportionate amount of LGBT people in their housing units and such. Reasons for this homelessness include family members that disown and kick out their family members for being LGBT. Job discrimination also contributes to homelessness, as well as housing discrimination, which is just as legal as the job discrimination is. Harassment is also a huge issue among gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. In public school, discrimination is a huge issue. About 74% of LGBT identifying students reported being verbally harassed, and 55% of them reported being discriminated against for their gender orientation. About half of these LGBT students also reported being harassed online, and 30% actually experienced physical harassment. Workplace harassment is also an issue, especially for trans folk. Lots of other kinds of harassment existed at a much higher rate for LGBT people, but there's honestly just not enough time in the video to discuss all of it. Health is also a huge issue for gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. To begin with, access to medical care is an issue, especially for LGBT youths, because they don't have money, they don't want to ask their parents for money, so they don't have access to the right things. Additionally, for trans people, they face difficulties through insurance companies not wanting to pay their bills, all the way down to doctors not wanting to perform them and doctors not listening to them about who they are and taking that into consideration. Moving on, basic health education is really hard to come by for gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. In public school sex education classes, homosexuality is almost never talked about, except for in the context of AIDS, and even then, information isn't always correct, or the emphasis isn't always right. There are surveys that show that gay people don't really see themselves very much in a lot of the sex education just because it's so focused on pregnancy and different things like that, so it's seen as more of a heterosexual problem. Public schools generally don't talk about STDs that can be transmitted through manual and oral sex, which is a huge problem. This lack of education still shows through HIV/AIDS statistics. In 2010, 63% of new transmissions were men who have sex with men. Although it's worth noting that these statistics don't actually separate out trans women from that. It's definitely worth noting because there is a huge HIV/AIDS problem in that population because of this lack of education and also other factors such as low self-efficacy and homelessness and different things that affect that as well. Intersex people also aren't taught very much about their own bodies, especially when a lot of them don't know that they're intersex. Education about intersex people is almost non-existent. From sex ed to anatomy class, it's just not really discussed, which is absolutely unacceptable. Mental health risks are also high for gender, sexual, and romantic minorities because of factors such as stigma from society and attitudes from friends and family, as well as factors such as economics and homelessness. They are at a higher risk for things such as depression and anxiety. Also, the higher percentage of harassment, including physical harassment, has driven instances of PTSD up as well. They are also at a higher risk for hopelessness, which is one of the biggest indicators of suicidality. People who identify as gay, lesbian, and bisexual are About 4 times more likely than the general populace is to attempt suicide. These numbers are generally slightly higher among bisexuals, but transgender people are 8 or more times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. 41% of that population will attempt suicide at some point in their life. And if that statistic doesn't scare you, I don't know what does. With all of this, it is important to note that every single one of these issues, and every issue that I did not list that affects the LGBT community, almost all of them affect trans people, particularly trans women of color, even more than any other portion of the population. LGBT issues, just as any other issue, is a lot more complicated than one set of numbers and one set of ideas. Every person is affected differently based on a multitude of different identities and different factors in their life. And trans women of color end up with the short end of the stick most of the time. This list is far from comprehensive. There are many other things that affect the LGBT community in America today, and many more that affect the LGBT community worldwide. So just try to remember, while this legislation is definitely a landmark and will be in history books someday, it is definitely not the end. That's all I really have time for today, so hopefully I will see you on Friday, Amanda.